I looked around at the faces of my family seated along the mahogany dining table and took a deep breath. My husband, Darwin, my father, Dan, my mother, Amber, and my older brother, Greg, had all gathered for what was called a family meeting. Outside, the spring rain continued to fall gently, and the droplets trickling down the window panes created a strange harmony with the tension inside the room. I felt my fingers trembling and clenched my fists under the table. My name is Stacy Taylor. Though I'm well past my mid-30s, whenever I return to my parents' house, I always feel like I'm 18 again. As I glanced at the living room wall lined with old family photos, I noticed that most of them highlighted Greg's various achievements. His high school football victories, his college graduation, and the success of his first real estate deal were all prominently displayed. On the other hand, the only photos of me were either family group pictures or ones where I was standing beside Greg. I work at an architectural design firm, but in conversations with my parents, my job was rarely a topic of discussion. Instead, conversations were always dominated by Greg's latest business successes and his next big deal. "Is there something urgent?" I asked. "A meeting this sudden is pretty unusual." Dan cleared his throat and exchanged a glance with Amber. My father, now over 70, seemed to have shrunk slightly from the strong build he once had. He had been a strict and stubborn man, but in recent years, he had softened. At least, that's what I had thought. "We wanted to talk about estate planning." I raised an eyebrow. My parents were in good health and had rarely spoken about death or inheritance before. Across the table, Greg wore a confident smile. His expensive suit and watch were a clear display of his supposed business success. "As we get older, we realize it's important to clarify what we have," Amber continued quietly. Her voice carried tension, as if her usual composed demeanor was faltering. "We don't have a large estate to leave behind for you two," Dan stated bluntly. "Our main asset is this house. And after we pass away, we've decided that this house will be inherited by Greg." A dull ache spread through my chest. What Dan was saying wasn't true. I knew my parents had inherited a substantial estate from my grandparents. Not just in cash, but also a lakeside vacation home. And yet, they had decided to leave nothing for me. All my life, I had been compared to my brother, Greg. One of my clearest memories was from when I was 10 years old at the school science fair. I had spent weeks preparing a project on urban planning and sustainable architecture. Even my science teacher had been impressed by how precise and well-crafted it was. Greg, on the other hand, had only started his project the night before the fair. He built a basic volcano model, something straight out of a textbook. On the day of the presentation, I won the grand prize and earned a spot at the state competition. Greg didn't even receive a participation award. When we got home, I rushed to show my parents my trophy. But in the living room, Greg had already captured their attention. "It's really too bad things didn't go well, Greg," my mother Amber said as she gently stroked his hair. "But next time, it will definitely go better." "That's right, Greg," Dan agreed. "You're really smart. You were just too busy with baseball, piano, and cram school." I stopped in front of the door, suddenly feeling the trophy in my hands grow heavier. With a bright smile, I pushed open the door and said, "Look! I won the grand prize." For a moment, my parents looked at me. "Oh, I see," Dan said. "That's good." Then he turned back to Greg. "Greg had a chance to go to the state competition, too," Amber sighed. "He's actually much better at science than you are." And so, my trophy was placed in the corner of the living room shelf. Meanwhile, Greg's participation medal for baseball was displayed in the center. As the state competition approached, my parents neither helped me practice nor bought me any additional materials. I prepared alone, and my school teacher was the one who took me to the venue. I won the state competition. A small article about it even appeared in the local newspaper. But that same weekend, Greg's baseball team placed third in the regional tournament. That was all my family talked about at dinner. My success was dismissed as just good luck. By the time I reached high school, the gap had only grown wider. I graduated at the top of my class, won an award in a national architectural design competition, and received scholarship offers from top-ranked universities. Meanwhile, Greg had above-average grades and was admitted to the local state university on a sports scholarship. Greg has a natural talent for business. My parents insisted. Amid such a life, the only solace I had was my grandfather. Every summer, I would visit the lakeside vacation home with him. My parents and Greg often stayed behind. For me, those visits were heaven. My grandfather would spend hours looking at my architectural sketches, giving me advice, and truly appreciating my talent. "You have a special eye, Stacy," he would always say. "You can see the soul within buildings." The summer I was 13, while my parents were attending Greg's regional baseball tournament, I stayed at the vacation home with my grandfather. That weekend, he took me to a local architectural exhibition. For the first time, I saw the works of female architects. "Look, Grandpa! Women can design such amazing buildings too." My grandfather smiled gently. "Of course, Stacy. And you can do the same. In fact, you'll create something even more remarkable." On the way back, he said to me, "The view from this vacation home is my treasure." He continued, "This house is filled with precious memories of you and me. One day, it will be yours." A few years later, the summer I was 17. It was the last summer I spent at the lakeside vacation home. My grandfather's health was deteriorating, but he still made time every day to look through my sketchbook. "One day, you will design magnificent buildings," he would say. One quiet evening at dusk, as we sat together on the pier, he took my hand. "Remember this, Stacy. You don't need to be compared to anyone. You shine with your own light." And just a few days before he passed away, in a weak voice from his hospital bed, he quietly said, "One day, make that vacation home your place." I still vividly remember the reading of his will after his passing. He had given clear instructions that his estate was to be divided fairly among the entire family. Where had that promise gone? I asked. That doesn't make sense. What happened to the assets Grandpa left behind? What about the lakeside vacation home? My voice trembled slightly with frustration. You must have inherited a significant amount of cash along with it. Grandpa told me he wanted me to have that vacation home one day. Amber's expression darkened. For a brief moment, her eyes flickered toward Greg, as if some unspoken signal had passed between them. That money is for our retirement, Amber answered defensively. If you ever need help in the future, Greg will be there for you. She clenched her hands together and looked toward Dan instead of at me. It felt like a rehearsed response. I turned to my brother. Greg wore a smug smile. He placed his wine glass on the table and leaned forward. Don't worry, Stacy. If anything happens, I'll take care of you. The authoritative tone in his voice made my face flush with anger. He had already discussed this with our parents before the family meeting. I had been excluded. It was presented as a done deal. I can't trust that promise. Besides, I am perfectly capable of taking care of myself, I said, my breath coming faster. I have a solid career and income at the design firm. I don't need Greg's charity. Darwin and I drove home in silence. The heavy rain pounded against the windshield, mirroring the turmoil inside my head. The modern house we lived in was my very first architectural project. When we decided to build a home after getting married, Darwin had believed in my talent and entrusted the entire design to me. This house carried my heart and soul. A house my parents had never once visited. They never care about me. They're too busy visiting Greg's new condominium. I muttered bitterly as I stepped inside. I turned on the living room lights and slipped off my shoes. Then, suddenly, I burst into tears. Darwin said nothing. He just held me. Can you believe it? They're leaving everything to Greg. Even the lakeside vacation home, everything is going to him. I finally voiced it. Grandpa wanted his inheritance to be shared equally between us. Darwin gently kissed my hair. After 7 years of marriage, he understood this deep pain of mine. The struggle of constantly seeking my parents' approval. The suffering of living in my brother's shadow. Maybe we should look into this, he said, sitting on the sofa and handing me a cup of tea. If there was an official will, there must be a record of it somewhere. The next day, I couldn't focus at work. Even in the middle of meetings, my thoughts kept drifting back to my parents' betrayal. During lunch, I called my college friend, Nicole. Nicole was a well-known family law attorney. Of course, if the will is a public record, I can look it up, Nicole said. And also the property deeds. Give me a few days, and I can find out. I spent the next few days in anxious anticipation. At night, I was haunted by nightmares. In one dream, the lakeside vacation home was sinking in a flood, and as I called out to Greg for help, he only stood on the shore, laughing. And every morning after waking from those nightmares, I would always recall the time I cared for my mother after her injury. 3 years ago, my mother had fallen down the stairs and fractured her leg. She was bedridden for 5 months. Unable to walk, she couldn't manage anything around the house. During that time, I visited my parents' home almost every day. Since my mother couldn't climb the stairs, I remodeled the first-floor living room into a bedroom for her. I drove her to and from the hospital, prepared dinner, and managed her medication. Greg only called occasionally to say he was concerned. At the time, my parents seemed grateful for my efforts. But now, I realized that it was nothing more than an illusion. A few days later, Nicole called me, followed by an email confirming my worst fears. Look at this. With trembling hands, I showed the documents to Darwin. Attached to the email was an official copy of the will and the real estate records. A will had already been made. The house, the vacation home, the savings, the insurance money, everything goes to Greg. I have been left with nothing. Darwin stared at the screen, his eyes darkening with anger. He, too, had a strong sense of justice. When was this made? He asked quietly. 3 years ago. Right after my mother fractured her femur. I answered bitterly. And then, my eyes widened at the date. When I was visiting the hospital every day, helping around the house. When Greg was barely involved at all. That bitter sense of betrayal spread through me. Even after she was discharged, I was the one helping my mother, managing her medication, and taking care of the household so she could recover. Nearly every day, I put my own work on hold to visit my parents' house, prepare frozen meals, do house repairs, and tend to the garden. Meanwhile, Greg only called occasionally, saying he was too busy with work. Even his rare visits, just a few times over several months, were met with gratitude from my parents, as if he had made some great sacrifice. It's as if everything I did meant nothing. I sighed. As if I were just a housekeeper. Darwin took my hand. They're just trapped in their own values. Greg is the eldest son, and a man, so. I know. I cut him off. They cherish Greg just because he's a man. But we are both their children equally. They're just hiding behind their own bias. That night, I couldn't sleep. For the next few weeks, I kept my contact with my parents to a minimum. I kept my responses brief when they called and repeatedly declined Sunday family dinners. Saying I'm busy with work was true, but it was only part of the reason. I wasn't ready to face their betrayal. At work, I turned my anger into energy. My designs became bolder and more innovative than ever, impressing clients. My colleagues were surprised by my sudden focus, but Darwin understood. I needed something to prove. Not to my parents, but to myself. One evening, when Darwin came home from work, he was more excited than usual. He loosened his tie, took a bite of the pasta I had made, and poured himself a glass of wine. "Listen to this, Stacy," he said in a low voice. "There's a major development project happening in your parents' neighborhood. Within a few months, the value of that land will double." I set down my fork. Woodland Hills? That area hasn't changed in decades. That's about to change. Darwin leaned in. The city council passed new zoning laws. Mixed-use developments in high-rise buildings will now be allowed. Investors are already making their moves. "How do you know this?" I asked. Darwin was a real estate developer and had been successful in property investments. But he shouldn't have had any specific knowledge about my parents' neighborhood. After a brief hesitation, he admitted, "Actually, my group is involved in the project." He confessed, "I hadn't told you, but I'm a key member of the investment group working on this." Darwin had been part of major projects before, but this one directly affected my childhood home. At first, it was a coincidence. A month ago, the plan was still in its conceptual stage. When the project started taking shape, I realized it included your parents' neighborhood. He explained, "I should have told you right away, but I know how complicated things are between you and your parents. I didn't want to drag you into it." He turned back and met my eyes. "But lately, I've felt like something was off, ever since your parents suddenly announced that Greg would inherit everything. As I looked into things further, I found something else. Greg is buried deep in debt. And I think he's been pushing your parents to sell the house." "What?" I exclaimed in shock. "Greg's company is supposed to be successful. He told me he earns hundreds of thousands of dollars a month." Darwin shook his head. "On the surface, it might look that way. But someone in my investment group has worked with Greg before. His real estate business has been running at a loss for years. He's been borrowing money just to maintain his image. Your parents' house could be used as collateral for his debts." I stood up and paced the room. "So that's why I was cut out of the will. If the house belongs to Greg, he can do whatever he wants with it." "It's a possible scenario." Darwin agreed. "But we can't be certain." The next morning, I woke up with my decision made. "I'm going to see my parents and ask for the truth," I told Darwin. But before I could make the call, my phone rang. It was Amber. "Stacy, I need to talk to you." Her voice was unsteady. "It's about the house." "All right, Mom," I said. "I'll come over." That afternoon, I headed to my parents' house. As usual, I greeted them at the door, showing the familiar courtesy I had practiced for years. To my surprise, not only were Dan and Amber there, but Greg was also in the sitting room. He looked uneasy, his usual confident demeanor noticeably absent. "Stacy, thank you for coming," Dan said. "We have something important to discuss." Amber held a teapot in her hands and placed a fragrant cup of tea in front of me. "We've decided to sell the house," Amber suddenly announced. "We received a good offer and, well, it's too big for us now." I set my cup down and stared at my parents. "Since when have you been planning this?" "Recently," Dan answered, but his eyes didn't meet mine. Like he had done for years, he rubbed his palm over the old wooden table. "This is something Greg and we decided together." "So, this was Greg's idea?" I asked directly. A heavy silence fell over the room. My parents exchanged anxious glances. Greg cleared his throat and straightened his posture. "Stacy, listen to me," Greg began, using the tone of someone negotiating a deal. "The property value in Woodland Hills has increased by 30% over the past 5 years. This house is too big for our parents and costs a lot to maintain. If they sell now, they can enjoy a comfortable retirement." "Right, but this was your suggestion, wasn't it?" I pressed. "Of course. I'm a professional, I understand market trends. Greg puffed out his chest. So what? I glanced at the papers left on the table. Beside the sale contract bearing a real estate company's logo, there were bank loan documents. I picked them up and flipped through them. This is a mortgage refinancing document. Why would they need a new loan if they're selling the house? I asked. Dan looked up nervously. Greg said they needed to renovate the house first to increase its value, and this loan would cover that cost. I turned to Greg. So, you're having our parents take out a loan against their home, under the guise of renovations? Don't put it like that, Greg snapped, raising his voice. This is just a business strategy. With renovations, the selling price will increase by over $100,000. And who's handling the renovations? I pushed further. Greg fell silent. Amber answered instead. One of Greg's business partners. He's offering a very reasonable price. I let out a sigh. Darwin's suspicion was correct. After returning home, I explained the situation to him. They're going to sell the house. Greg must have convinced them because of his debt. That's probably the case, Darwin agreed. But there's still a way to stop it. How? The house is set to go up for auction in a few weeks, he explained. We can buy it. We don't have that kind of money. We do, Darwin said. My company has been very successful. If we see this as an investment. I thought about it for a long time. Then, I made my decision. Thank you, Darwin. Let's do it. On the day of the auction, Darwin and I attended in disguise. The bidding was intense, and the price skyrocketed, but in the end, we won. A few days later, I called my parents and Greg. I want to have a family meeting. Tomorrow night, at the house. I told them. The next day, Dan, Amber, and Greg gathered in the living room. They looked uneasy. What's going on, Stacy? Amber asked. You've been acting strange lately. I have something to say, I said, pulling out an envelope filled with documents. Darwin and I were the ones who bought your house at the auction last week. The room fell silent. What? Greg shouted. That's impossible. It's possible. Here's the proof. I took out the property deed. This house is mine now. Why would you do such a thing? Dan asked. His voice was shaking. I know why you were in such a hurry to sell this house, I said calmly. Greg, you wanted to sell before the property value increased so you could cash out. You were using our parents to pay off your debts. Greg's face turned pale. That's a lie. Is it? I pulled out another set of documents. Here's the proof of Greg's debt. Darwin's company analyst found it. He owes a significant amount to the bank and was planning to use this house as collateral. My parents looked stunned. Greg, is this true? Amber asked, her voice trembling. Mom, Dad, Greg was planning to use the house to cover his debt. He's on the verge of bankruptcy. Don't lie. Greg shouted, standing up. My husband investigated your financial situation. I said calmly. The bank records show that your company has over $3 million in debt. Your credit is ruined. That's why you were trying to use our parents' house to secure new funds. Amber placed a hand on her chest, looking at Greg with a worried expression. There are ups and downs in business, Greg said defensively. I'm just dealing with a temporary cash flow issue. Dan buried his face in his hands. You lied to us? It's not a lie, Greg shouted. It's strategic information management. I just didn't want you to worry. I delivered the final blow. And out of the proceeds from this sale, how much would actually go to our parents? Wouldn't most of it be used to pay off your debts? The color drained from Greg's face. Of course, they would get a fair share. How much? I pressed. Greg didn't answer. His silence said everything. There's one more thing you should know. Darwin is a key investor in the development project for this area, I continued. That's how we knew the house was being put up for sale. And I also knew that you removed me from the will. If you had followed Greg's plan, Mom and Dad would have been drowning in debt instead of enjoying their retirement. Amber started to cry. Dan looked utterly exhausted. Stacy, not now. I raised my hand, cutting off my father's words. I'm not planning to demolish this house. Instead, Darwin and I have revised the development plan to preserve the house while redeveloping the surrounding area. I revealed the modified blueprint of the development plan. But there are conditions. What conditions? Dan asked. First, a new will must be created, dividing all assets equally between Greg and me. Second, I must have an equal say in family decisions. And lastly, the family photo wall should celebrate not just Greg's achievements but mine equally. Greg's face turned red with anger as he stood up. I won't be blackmailed like this. This isn't blackmail. I replied calmly. I'm simply asking for fairness. If you refuse my conditions, I will demolish the house and proceed with development. If that happens, you'll have nowhere to live. Dan and Amber exchanged glances. After a long silence, Dan let out a deep sigh. All right, he admitted quietly. We have been unfair to you. We'll accept your conditions. Greg stormed out in fury. Amber approached me, crying. I'm sorry, Stacy. She sobbed. We were wrong. I maintained my composure as I replied. I hope we can build a different relationship from now on. When I returned home, Darwin was waiting. How did it go? They accepted the conditions, I said, but I still couldn't sort through my emotions. They apologized, but I don't know if it was truly from the heart. Maybe it was just for their own sake. It will take time. Darwin put his arm around my shoulder. I nodded. The following week, my parents signed a new will under the supervision of a lawyer. I was given equal decision-making rights in family matters. And in the living room, where only Greg's achievements had been celebrated for years, new photos were added, my graduation, my promotions, and the professional awards I had received. 1 year later, I sat at the table, reviewing the documents laid before me, while watching the rain begin to fall outside the window. Darwin placed his hand on my shoulder and gently asked, Are you okay? Yes. I just think it's ironic, I said. On the table lay Greg's latest financial report. His company had completed its bankruptcy proceedings, and several of his assets had been seized by creditors. Since that day, he had been crushed under the weight of his debts. The luxury condominium, the expensive cars, and the glamorous lifestyle he had worked so hard to maintain were all gone. Now, he lived in a small suburban apartment, drove a used car, and was practically blacklisted from the real estate industry. I muttered. He's finally facing the consequences of his actions, deceiving our parents, cutting me out of the inheritance, and trying to use the house as collateral. Since then, I had barely spoken to my parents or Greg. I wasn't ready to reconcile until I was certain they had truly changed. Instead, Darwin kept occasional contact. Dan started working part-time as a consultant for an old colleague's construction company. Amber is working at a local restaurant. Darwin updated me. I felt a pang of disappointment, wondering if they were still trying to rescue Greg even now. Dan says it's to teach Greg responsibility. Instead of giving him money, they want to show him how to earn it himself. I was surprised to hear that. For the first time, my parents seemed to truly understand the situation and, instead of coddling Greg, were teaching him to face reality. Greg seems to be changing, too. Darwin continued. He's started taking night classes in business management at the local community college. And on weekends, he's working at a friend's construction site. I walked to the window. I hope he truly learns and changes. I didn't know if they would ever truly change. But what mattered most was that I had finally found my voice. For years, I had longed for my family's approval. Now, I knew I didn't need it. The life Darwin and I built was valuable. And now, I had the strength to move forward on my own terms.